have a degree in mechanical engineering. That's what I was doing in university before I came here. And but I always loved art, music, recreational programming and stuff like that. So it was kind of that package of things that I love to do. And just as I was graduating, I found out through a local TV show actually that BioWare was here in Edmonton. They were a video game company with an anticipated new game called Baldur's Gate. So I thought, whereas I was interested in becoming a pilot and I was interested in doing engineering and stuff like that, I thought about video games and I realized there's probably more of what I like to do that I could actually apply if I worked in video games than if I was to do something else. And so I actually started at BioWare as a 3D artist, and I did models for Neverwinter Nights and stuff like that. But I started doing a lot of technical art. So, it's things like anything from programming to figuring out how to make better art tools and stuff like that. And that really gave me a lot of access to the different parts of a project. So I was able to learn what everyone's job is and how everything comes together. Within a couple of years really taught me a lot about how games are made. And when we got the opportunity to do the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic project, I was fortunate to become the project director for that. And so I did Knights of the Old Republic and then the Mass Effect series. I think when we finished Knights of the Old Republic, we had a lot of fun making that game. We loved Star Wars, and we were really happy with what we had made. But I think there was another challenge out there for us. We basically wanted to do something very similar, make a console RPG, on the PC, on the console. We wanted it to be a little bit more accessible in terms of action that people understand versus kind of a D20 turn-based thing. We wanted to do something similar but better in a few ways. And we knew there was another challenge out there, which is, what if we could create our own universe for this and not play in someone else's as much as we love Star Wars? So that was the genesis, is you take the Knights of the Old Republic team and think about a new IP with a little bit more accessible kind of shooter-based gameplay. And from that, we started working on what became Mass Effect 1. I put a few notes on paper, and Greg and Ray and I had a meeting over lunch at a Greek restaurant near here, and we just talked about the high-level ideas of what this kind of game should be, and some of the fantasy of the games that we loved that we wanted to try and recapture. For me, it's games like Starflight going back to 1986, games like Deus Ex with, there's shooter stuff, but there's skills to it, and so we talked about these kinds of things, and ultimately we gave ourselves a rough framework, but it really took probably a year or more before we really had a handle on what it was. I mean, it starts with basic questions like, should there be aliens? You can have a great science fiction property with no aliens. It's just humans and planets and exploration and stuff like that, but no aliens. And should we have other planets, or should we make it like a Pitch Black kind of thing where you're on a planet and it's a story that's limited to that location, which you can do a great job of, but it's a choice, right? So we had to think about all these choices that were to be made. Is there time travel? Is there teleportation? And then only once we kind of had those things locked down did we start moving forward with what's the best story to tell in that kind of a world, and what other fantasy fulfillment things do we have for players? Wanting to have your own ship, having a reason to be able to make decisions in deep space with impunity, like a James Bond or a Jedi or Jack Bauer. It's like, what's that reason for why you get to make decisions that are important, and that became the idea behind the Spectres. I'm a big fan of sci-fi. I've got an extensive collection, and I like to buy the bins in the grocery store for DVDs for $3 and stuff like that. So I think it's fun to get movies, and even movies that are examples of things not to do, but to me there's something to the magic of science fiction and the fantasy of being able to do things that you can't otherwise do. It's one of the benefits actually that we have of being a studio that makes games in different genres, is there are people who love fantasy and really understand fantasy. And so we've got Dragon Age, and we've got people who feel that way about science fiction, really know about science fiction and how to capture that fantasy. And then we also have a lot of people who like both of them and end up working on both games, and we bring the sensibilities across from one to the other. Anytime you create something new, and we've seen this many times before, and you can see it when there's a new movie out, or a new book or whatever. Anytime there's something new, obviously the less you know about it, the easier it is to say that it's exactly like this or it's exactly like that. And ultimately, though, I think the people who really understand what Mass Effect is, they can see that there's originality in there, and it's got an integrity to itself. It's not based on or meant to try and recapture something else. However, I think what you can and should do is understand, and it's not just within science fiction, it's just entertainment. When you look at, for example, one of my favorite movies is Gladiator. And there's an amazing structural thing that happens in Gladiator around the value system they set up and what victory means for the hero in that movie, which is ultimately for him, and the values they set up for him, and understanding the afterlife and wanting to get there. For him, victory is being able to die and be with his family. And understanding these kinds of things from all through entertainment, and being able to break them down into their principles and then build those principles back up into something fresh. That's what we try to do. I think one thing that is interesting about what we're doing with Mass Effect, it's a popular story to run, is like, do games do, sex well enough? Do they do romance well enough? But the reason that we have romance in our games, I think it's twofold. First, people react very well to it. If you dabble in it to kind of play with it and then criticize it, if you're not emotionally invested in it, then when you see or do certain things, then you'll be critical. But for people who pursue these things, and they are relationships that you pursue, you have to pursue them to get them to happen. It's not pressing A and then you get a scene. For the people who are actually thinking about the relationships and thinking about which characters they like and progressing these relationships in the game, I think we've had tremendous feedback from it. It's one of the favorite parts of our games, according to our fans and the feedback that we get. But the other thing is, I think, especially over the course of a trilogy, we're doing some pretty interesting things with the way you have a relationship with a character in the first game, and then they're really not there for you in the second game, but other people are. And then, when you come back to the third game, they're there again. And have you had a different relationship with other characters? How do these things affect, a relationship on a much larger scale than even just one game? So I think there's fun things that we're doing with that, with relationships across a series that have never really been done before. Well, the idea of creating a trilogy that preserved your choices, not just throughout one game, but across the entire trilogy, was actually in the very original concept for Mass Effect and what the trilogy was about. And that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, actually, is that back in 2005, we announced Mass Effect, and we talked about what it was, and we talked about that it was a trilogy, and that there would be this concept of being able to move your save game across. Now, it's very important to also mention that we build these games so that people can enter them at any point, and that it's a great starting experience, and that's how Mass Effect 3 is designed. In fact, better than ever, it's a great place to start in the Mass Effect universe. But for people who have played with us all along, the idea that you create a character and then these choices and these relationships actually span huge game titles, that's something that's never been done before, and I would argue might never be done again. It's very hard, very expensive, very complicated. And even the idea of saying that you're going to do a trilogy, you have to plan that you're going to do that, but to be able to do that and know that it's going to have to span recessions. It's going to have to span changes in the industry and the way people consume games, the way people play them. It's been a huge victory for us just to do 3 games, let alone being able to also do this save game feature that we do. We find comfort in doing something that's ambitious. I think where we would be nervous is if we were doing something where we weren't sure what was going to be great about it. But by calling out things that are going to be amazing, we know that if we achieve those things, then we'll do well. And so that was part of the fun of developing Mass Effect is, we created these huge goals for ourselves, knowing that if we could ever achieve these things, create an IP that millions of people could identify with and enjoy being in, and do all 3 games and complete that as a package. If we could do these things, then we felt we would be successful. And I think we've been able to do that. Naming is always a hard thing to do in games. We have to name so many things. So I actually have a list of just great names for stuff, especially with important names, like the title of a game series, for example, is just brutal because everything you come up with, you compare it against other names is kind of the natural thing to do. Is it as good as Star Wars? Is it as good as this or that? But these are things that you might have grown up with and had in your life, since you were a child. So no new name can really stand up to these things that are known. Similarly, when naming our character, we wanted to make sure that the character had a last name at least, so that people could talk to you, because we knew that there'd be full voiceover and we wanted people to address you. But then the question is, what should that name be? And so we were thinking, we'd like it to be kind of an all-American name. We don't want it to be something really, really specific and incredibly unique, because then it's like, well, why that? Why that particular name? So we wanted it to be a name that was quite common and kind of an American name. And so we looked at some of the names of the first 7 astronauts, which have these great names, like Cooper and Shepard and stuff like that. And ultimately, the name Shepard, the astronaut himself, I think, is, from what I understand, is a lot like the way that we imagine our Shepard, which is very tough, very respected. When the reason that Alan Shepard was the first American in space is because he was voted to be the first by his peers. That's how they chose, and it was out of respect. He wasn't necessarily the most popular of them, but he was the one that they chose amongst themselves to put forward. And so there's a lot of great stuff about that, and then it has the second meaning, which is he's the first human Spectre, and there's a shepherding of humanity quality to that. Generally, the writers come up with their own names. When we're really stuck for something that, for whatever reason, the name is going to be really important, like I said, we end up bouncing it around through email and whatever, and then I go to my list that I have of great names. And then for actually the planets in Mass Effect 1, I made a planet and name generator in Excel. And so you hit a button, and it actually generates a name, and it generates all the properties of the planet, so that they make sense relative to orbit sizes and stuff like that. And then they have a description. I think the descriptions were still written by hand by a writer, but I think the names still came from the name generator that I made in Excel. Usually there's a writer who writes codex entries. We have a writer who does planet entries, and usually that person also is kind of the go-to person for any questions. I mean, this universe is actually bigger than can fit in my head or our lead designers or whatever, so I actually am not able to answer every question about how the whole universe works. But we do have at least one writer who has almost all of that, the whole IP and how everything works in terms of the backstory and the characters and civilizations and stuff like that. We definitely need that because it actually takes several people in a room to be able to know almost everything about the Mass Effect universe. We do have internal documents that keep track of most of it, but to be honest, the fastest way seems to be searching the internet. There's amazing documentation out on the internet that we use, and fans have taken the time to organize it really well, and sometimes we actually use that. There have been a few cases where, you know, a made-up word or whatever in a different language turns out to mean something that we never intended, and then we just change it because, you know, we don't want to offend anyone. But yeah, usually it's or, you know, a symbol. You know, a symbol, just it might be something that we made up, and then we'll find out it looks exactly like some corporate symbol that's out there. So we have to be careful, but we've got a lot of great people who check that stuff. When we were working on Mass Effect 2, we thought, hey, let's make something it's just something, a little Easter egg. You can buy it in the store, and it's a magazine called Fornax. And I always thought that sounded a little bit dirty. I think it's a star, and we kind of left it at that. But that has taken on a life of its own in the world of fan art, and I don't recommend you look at it unless that's the kind of thing you want to see. And it's extreme. Well, we always have a pretty extensive process of analyzing feedback. You know, people that are on our forums don't see me posting in there, but I'm reading it. If you've posted something about Mass Effect on YouTube, I've probably read it. So our fans have a voice that gets heard. And it's usually a process that we do, you know, obviously throughout a game, but especially once we've shipped something. For a couple of months, we shift into a period of really listening to what people are saying, and trying to understand it and analyze it. Because what we don't try to do is just build exactly what people tell us we should build, because then there's no surprise in it, and it's not necessarily exactly what they would want. But what we do try to do is, you know, all feedback is valid, and all feedback is true for that person, and in some way that we probably need to address. So we take it very seriously that way, and then we try to analyze, you know, how do we address this in terms of a game design that doesn't just become you know, a piecemeal collection of different solutions, but it still has that kind of elegant simplicity to it. How do we build that in? And then that's kind of how we try to build our next game. When we shipped Mass Effect 1, the first thing that we did was we took all the feedback that we could find, all the reviews, the forum stuff, and we literally started cutting and pasting comments. And so we had like one file that had all the positive comments and one that had all kinds of critical comments. And then we started categorizing them into like enemy AI or graphics or whatever. And that became like a list of, almost prioritized list of things that basically people in a meta sense were telling us needed to be different, you know. And so one of the top things from Mass Effect 1 was, in the end, we weren't able to reduce the texture load in to the degree that we wanted to. It came right down to the wire, and we got it better and better, but it wasn't as good as we would have wanted. And that was actually one of the biggest pieces of feedback we had on the first game. And so that became the top priority thing for us. It doesn't mean that was the most important thing in the game, but it was just one of those things that here's like basically our list of 5 things that these things have to happen, because we can't not fix these things that people have asked us to. And then other things just down through, you know, AI and vehicles and all that kind of stuff. So we had a list of not even specific changes, but categories. We had, I think it was 48 categories of changes that we implemented for Mass Effect 2, and we ended up doing them all. And then within each of those, there are a few changes. You know, like combat, for example, was just one category, but it was a huge list of things that we did. So, yeah, I mean, you think about the millions of people who play, all the different media that they have to share their feedback. There's a lot of commentary out there. But we still try and mine it, and then, like I say, every bit of feedback is valid and true for the person who's giving it. So we need to take it seriously and analyze what it means in terms of something we need to resolve in the game. The victory for us with Mass Effect 2 was that even though we did make a lot of big changes to the way that you play the game and the way that the systems work and things like that, in general, like on balance, it was extremely well received, like just really better than we could have ever hoped. It's one of the highest rated games of all time. But that doesn't mean that we don't still look at criticisms from fans and feedback and trying to understand how we can still make Mass Effect 3 better. And so that's where I think we hit the right kind of systems and the right kind of gameplay for what a Mass Effect game should be about. But there's improvements that we can and are making across the board, but we're not fundamentally changing things. But what we are doing, for example, is we're looking at the feedback that we've had that people want more out of the RPG systems, and they want more depth and they want more customization. And so we're doing a lot of those things, but we're doing it in the style that you had in Mass Effect 2, where you still have weapons the way they work in Mass Effect 2, and you still have armor lockers and stuff like that. But now you've got a lot more to buy at stores, and you've got a lot more to customize your armor and your weapons. And when you're modifying a weapon, you see it sitting on the table, and you're seeing parts click in and out of it, and you have a lot of options to do with that. So we're coming back to a place where you have the customizability that you had in Mass Effect 1 and a lot of those choices in that activity chain, but combining it with the way that the systems were really fun and I think well presented in Mass Effect 2. But also, again, just kind of going back and improving the way that all of this stuff works and the way it all looks. Well, from the beginning, we actually knew the high-level story arc. Like the basic premise of what each game was going to be about. And that allowed us to have an idea where we're going with the major characters and with Shepard and the larger forces in the galaxy and things like that. But what we stayed open to is being able to react to things that were working really well about the way we tell stories or the way that certain characters are received and so on. For example, when we were designing Mass Effect 1, we actually didn't know how well our alien characters would work. We knew that this would be a very realistic looking game by comparison to Xbox games, which is what we were coming out of, and we were thinking, what's the next Xbox going to be capable of, because it didn't even have a name at that point. And so we're trying to visualize what is possible with these characters. And one thing that we thought at the time was we're going to create digital actors, and we had an idea for how well those would work. But we thought we need to be careful about making too many aliens in the environment or putting too much acting and emotion on the aliens because they're not human. And we didn't know that if they would be able to be as expressive as humans. And as it turns out, partly because they're not human and partly because the technology and the art worked out so well, our aliens are almost more human than our humans. They have incredible emotion. And when we made Mass Effect 1 and we saw how people reacted to it, we saw that they wanted romances with Garrus, who's a character with an exoskeleton. These amazing reactions to our characters that showed us we can start relying more on these characters to carry more of the emotion of the story. And so we did that with Mass Effect 2. Garrus became more of Shepard's buddy. And that relationship really worked better than we would have planned ahead of time. And in fact, Garrus can be a romance character, which was probably our most popular romance character. And we never would have known that until we had built the first game. So we can react to those kinds of things as we go. But knowing kind of where things are going allows us to put it in a context where it's still all going to fit. It's not like we have to come up with some crazy new excuse to start a new story. It's all kind of there. With Mass Effect 2, it was kind of different because there wasn't the volume of criticism or critical comments that we had, and the areas were a lot fewer than we had on Mass Effect 1. So we had kind of fewer things to resolve, but one of them was that people recognized that if you come into an area and there's lots of low cover height stuff, then there's going to be a fight, even before we've brought up the dramatic tension that should tell you you're in a fight. So that obviously was something we wanted to improve. So that became a whole list of things that we wanted Shepard to do differently. So it's things like there's much better, types of cover built into the environment better. Shepard is able to move between them a lot better. And so we kind of morphed that into just what other things should Shepard be able to do in an environment so that the environment itself is more credible. And so Shepard is able to do SWAT turns from one cover to the other. You can mantle with a single button instead of getting into cover first. You can climb things, you can fall down things, and it's very much a much more free-form environmental exploration thing while you're in combat. And then also just the idea of, to further break the idea that you see a little battlefield and you know you're going to have a fight, we're doing a lot more redirects in terms of the level. So you see an area and you think, okay, I'm going to go through here and maybe have a fight. You might not actually ever get to that area because something amazing will happen and the floor breaks through and now you're in the basement, or you're in you're going through a cave and it gets blocked off, and just constantly redirecting the player so that you kind of build a sense that anything could happen versus building in a sense of security and kind of knowing what's going to happen next.